Chapter 17. Beatings. The next morning, the storms had cleared, leaving lavender clouds floating on a pink sky. The winter sun rose slowly, pale and distant, its light doing little to alleviate the cold on the deck of the ship, where Haille gathered at the stern with the crew and passengers to say goodbye to Victor Twenge. Val and Chloe wrapped his body in a gray shroud, and in solemn silence, the crew dropped him over the rail. The shroud billowed and rippled briefly, flaring under water before slipping out of sight, the ballast sewn into the bottom pulling Victor's body to the sea floor, out of reach of wind, sun, and even the friends he had made of his former foes.
A worthy adversary, and in the end, an honorable friend,
Val said. Chloe wiped tears from her eyes, Gunther's arm around her shoulders. The newly freed men paid their respects in a long silence before one anonymous sailor started to sing. It was a bittersweet dirge that lasted long enough that when it was finished, Victor was long lost in the distance. The sailors returned to their posts, and the others went below decks out of the bite of the wind. Haille remained at the stern. Somehow, cold air and solitude was preferable to the crush of bodies below deck, where there was little to do but nap, play dice, or idly chat the hours away. His relief at being freed had faded quickly with Victor's death and the news Val and Chloe had shared of Antas. His home in chaos, overrun with Vorgs, the citizens scattered, the Enton Council fled to Carazans, the city under siege by an army of the monsters. Was it all retribution for what he and his friends had done? Had they started this war while trying to save his father from another? Haille wondered what other failures awaited him. His body sagged against the rail. He had escaped a prison of stone, only to be trapped in one of his mind, with walls of guilt, remorse, and self-recrimination. Azure, who had accompanied his friends in their long search for him, kept him company at the rail, but even her familiar presence did little to lift his spirits. If anything, he found it remarkable that the sight of the jay, who had followed him so faithfully throughout his travels, left him with little feeling at all. He listened as a set of footsteps climbed the companion ladder to the deck behind him. He imagined it was a crew member making rounds. He felt no desire to engage, so he continued to stare out at sea, even as the footsteps came alongside and stopped.
"Spar with me, Prince,"
Val said. Haille turned to see his friend holding two wooden practice swords, the points balanced on the planking of the deck.
"Maybe later,"
Haille said, shifting his gaze back to the sea and the foaming wake of the ship. One of the swords clattered on the deck, its handle next to his foot.
"No, now,"
Val said, his voice ticking on an edge.
"It will do you some good."
Haille met Val's gaze. His eyes were narrow and focused, his scarred jaw set at a stubborn angle. Haille knew his excuses numbered few to none. He picked up the practice sword and raised it limply while Val settled into a fighting stance. The captain would not indulge Haille's listlessness, driving in with a quick strike that knocked Haille's blade to the side before following with a slap to his shoulder. The strike stung, the pain shooting through Haille's body, waking him up and sparking a flare of anger in his chest. Val read the change in his expression.
"If you don't like being hit, do something about it."
Haille would. He settled into his own fighting stance, just in time, for Val attacked again. This time, Haille parried his strikes, dodging and weaving and returning with counter-strikes that clacked against Val's wooden blade.
"There's life in you still, but is there fight?"
Val feinted right, then cut left, his feet dancing across the deck in quick, measured steps. Haille chose to drive forward, slipping into Val's radius of attack, locking blades before spinning away with a glancing blow to Val's neck. They exchanged a volley of attacks in succession, the match attracting the attention of the crew, a few whom gathered around the ladders to watch. Val was a much different opponent than Gregor had been, and Haille was forced to use more advanced combinations. Before long, he was panting, his heart beating in his ears and sweat slick on his forehead. He removed his outer doublet to cool off and to allow him more freedom of movement. It felt like an hour passed before Val took a knee and called for water. One of the crew tossed him a water skin. He shared it with Haille before drinking from it himself and sitting back on his haunches. Haille copied him, setting his sword to balance on his knee.
A man needs something to fight for, Haille, to awaken him, to rally his efforts against.
Haille nodded, realizing the effort of the fight had done him some good. At least for the time he was engaged, he had forgotten his sadness, his melancholy, even though he already felt it returning as his pulse slowed again. He wondered, would he have to become manic to forget the failures and losses he had endured, the failures and losses that he had yet to endure but already worried about? It felt like too much. The walls of his prison were returning. Val readjusted his legs beneath him.
There is no shortage of evil in this world to oppose, Haille. You just have to make the choice to fight it, and not to dishonor yourself in the process.
What cause is there left to fight for, to honor?
All of them. Pick one. Your father's legacy, your own honor, your own home.
Dust, non-existent, and in ruin, all three.
The people who remain in Antas are in danger. Even if you don't recognize the sacredness of your life, you must recognize the value of theirs. In turn, you will find your meaning again.
What makes you think I've lost meaning?
Otherwise, you wouldn't be perched on this poop deck contemplating your failures.
Haille dropped his chin into his chest and twisted his mouth. Was he so transparent? On the island, it seemed that those were all I could remember. All my choices had brought me to failure.
Imprisonment can do that to a man. Put him in a stupor of self-pity and doubt.
Val took his sword and tapped Haille on the shoulder.
I'm here to wake you up. It's what friends are for. Be a man of deeds, Haille, not of regrets. Purpose is the best weapon against those demons that torment you from within.
I'd settle just to be happy again.
Life does not owe you happiness, just purpose,
Val said, standing up and readying his sword.
Let's fight.
Their practices continued daily as they sailed on the northeast winds towards Soledor Cove, formerly a nest for pirates and smugglers, but now an outpost for those Antons resisting the invasion of the Vorgs and hoping to free the council from the siege in Carisans.
They are an army, awaiting a commander,
Val said to Haille as they sparred one morning.
Then I best get you in fighting shape, Captain,
Haille said, dodging a blow and skirting close to Val to stab him. Val parried the thrust.
I'm a captain, but not a commander. For that, the people need a symbol, someone they know. They need you, the prince,
Val said, punctuating the statement with a jab that slipped past Haille's defenses and stung him in the stomach. He stood, stunned.
Me? But I was disgraced in Kerith. Oion himself sentenced me. Oion was not himself, I already told you. His wife sent us to find you. She knows what kind of leader you can be.
But I rode the very creature that slew my father.
Do you really think Adamantus was the same as those things?
Val asked, dropping his sword low and stepping close to Haille. No, but will the people believe that?
They'll believe in you. They will have to. Being a prince carries with it hope.
That hope feels heavy, Haille said, stepping back into a fighting stance. Haille had grown used to training in the morning and resting in the afternoon, but Val and Chloe seemed to have different plans in mind for him, for Chloe came to him as he dozed in a hammock after the midday meal, turned him out onto the floor, and tapped the end of her battle staff next to his head. Gregor sniggered at him from his own hammock across the cabin. "No rest for royalty," she said, then tossed her own staff to Haille. She held Val's in her hand as she walked up the stairs above deck. Haille followed, still weary from the morning's training. Chloe granted no leniency, battering him and castigating him for mistakes. The staff was a new weapon for him, so there were many miscues and no shortage of opportunities for her to correct him. Haille was not the only one receiving instruction. Gregor joined Gunther, and they settled into the corner of the same deck and exchanged knowledge about spells and enchantments, taking turns being teacher and student. Haille was always the student with Chloe, and he found her an even harder taskmaster than Val. She was faster, and read his movements before he made them, anticipating his attacks and countering with an effectiveness that often put Haille on his back. After one such flattening, Chloe let Haille rest and settled down cross-legged next to him. Watching the clouds drift across the blue sky, Haille thought aloud. "Val told me to be a man of deeds, Chloe." "Deeds are worthy, true," she said, sipping water. "A good cause is even worthier, but only in so much as it helps the thriving and fulfillment of others." "You sound like a philosopher." "I speak from the codes of the Order of Oban. Some say that is just what we are." She offered him the skin of water. "If we live in the world of individuals, Haille, it's a selfish, meaningless world indeed." Haille propped himself up on his elbow. "You and Val talk a lot about meaning." "We have spent our lives trying to weave it into all our actions." "Actions for a right cause are meaningful." Chloe shrugged. "That is what Val would say." Her eyes darted to her husband, who was repeating an incantation for Gregor to memorize. Her face softened. "Love of others is meaningful too." "Now, pick up your staff and prepare for a beating." Chapter 18. Chastain Manor. Lorna was nothing if not resourceful. She assembled 24 hardy men with horses, armed and ready to ride by the next morning. "There is no end to your industriousness, my lady," Darrett said, mounting Barnaby. "I don't know how you find the time." "I'm old," Lorna said, patting Barnaby's neck. "I can't sleep at night, so I scheme." "And she naps in the afternoon," Sorrel said, handing up a satchel to Talia. Katlyn was pleased to see a sort of kinship had formed between the two girls from such different backgrounds, yet so similar, each exhibiting a quiet confidence. They both stayed up during the night, sharing what they knew of herbal concoctions and potions from their respective people, even as Katlyn had been nodding off. They set out, an organized troop of sorts, with Darrett at their lead and Adamantus at his side. Gale followed in the role of Darrett's squire, and Katlyn and Talia in their wake. The rest of the men rode in pairs along the trade road, their weapons at the ready. But as they rode, they found they did not need much vigilance. The Eastlands were empty of people and Vorgs. Not a single sign of the monsters was to be found, not a print, a scent, a kill, or spore. Katlyn was relieved, and with so many men along with them, she slept soundly at night, nurturing the hope that perhaps the horde had returned to the forest, or at least been defeated. "Don't let your guard down," Gale said to her as warning one night, as they tucked their blankets around themselves. "There is a lot of land to cover as of yet." There was, and as they moved west towards the city and past more abandoned farmsteads and deserted villages, Katlyn could not help but think of all those she had come to know, Pathis and Annette, Garn and his kinfolk, not to mention her own family. The emptiness of the countryside grew ominous, a foreboding that deepened with every league they marched. With no sign of friend or foe, their unanswered questions grew to many. Soot had gone south, delivering a message to Kerith. sharing news and seeking aid. Sapphire had remained, ready to send back more news. Yet more days passed, and they had none. Daylight was encroaching on the long winter nights, the sky lightening earlier, the stars emerging later, yet the days were still often gray, with a lid of clouds pressed low on the bowl of the sky. The winter silence was absolute, with only the sound of the wind rushing through bare branches, occasionally punctuated by the sound of a barn door swinging open on an abandoned farmstead. Raindrops came and went, dampening their cloaks and muddying the ground. Even their horses grew subdued, their heads low, their hooves heavy with the mud of the road. They were outside Kinth when they found their first sign of the battles that had been waged. A horrid odor greeted them at the edge of town, and in a field not far from the road, they found the ashes of a great pyre. The bodies burnt were no ordinary creatures, as the malformed skulls with rows of needle teeth attested. The dead Vorgs were all too familiar to Katlyn. The charred bones, the blackened armor, all were strange and hideous. The men wore grave expressions while Darryd circled the pyre on Barnaby.
"Better dead than live," he said. "Do they burn their own?"
"No," Adamantus said, circling the pile in the opposite direction. "This is the work of men."
"Then we have allies."
Darryd scanned the horizon as if to spot them.
"But what has become of them?"
Gale asked. No answers were apparent, but Darryd thought it necessary to at least visit the manor of the appointed seat of the government council.
"If there is a stronghold, it will be there. We might find survivors."
"I know the way," Katlyn said. She rode to the head of their column and led them down streets she had walked with Cody the previous autumn when she had first recruited Val and his friends as allies. How different the town was this day. The streets were abandoned, empty of people, and covered instead with wind-blown leaves from the previous season. Some houses were boarded up, others had been left in haste, the front doors ajar. Katlyn remembered Pathis' account of Cadre, this village built too close to Sidon Wood, where in one night all the inhabitants disappeared, taken by Vorgs. History repeats itself. The town square was empty and silent, but for the bucket of the village well creaking in the breeze on its crank. Dark patches of blood stained the cobblestones. Whether it was human or Vorg, there was no telling, but the men of the party rode with their weapons drawn. Gale kept an arrow ready in her bow, Talia a spear in her hand. The main road leading to the Chastain Manor was also transformed. Gone was the tunnel of turning leaves. They had fallen to molder on the ground. Bare skeletal branches interlocked overhead, the sky the color of a tombstone beyond. Again they were met by the smell of the dead as they neared the manor. The gates stood open. A few tools, hoes, rakes, shovels, lay in the courtyard, along with an empty yoke and a few overturned buckets. The smell of rot drifted from the stables. One of the men rode in, only to return, his sleeve lifted to cover his nose.
"The animals, all dead."
"Slain?" Darryd asked.
"No, looks more like they starved to death."
The men formed a perimeter around the manor house, Katlyn stealing a glance at the holding cells, where Garn had cut Val and Cody loose. She dismounted and entered the manor with Darryd, Adamantus, Gale, and Talia. The tapestries that had formerly adorned the walls sat in moldy piles, the seal of the Chastain fox torn and laying in scraps on the floor. Furniture was broken and upended. By silent understanding, the others followed Katlyn, since she had been there once before, albeit as a prisoner. When they reached the anteroom, where she and Haille had once been dazzled by the bejeweled hilts and scabbards of swords, they found the walls stripped bare. Nothing of the treasures left there, except their shapes on the faded wall. No one was in the hall where she had once met Annabeth Chastain, and learned of Annabel's low place in the household as a bastard child. But as they stood and listened, the dead silence was broken by the sound of footfalls creaking across the boards overhead.
"Someone is upstairs," Darrett said. "We'll take the main staircase up," Adamantus said.
They filed after him, climbing the stairs in the front hall. At the top, they turned down a corridor in the direction of the sounds. Katlyn saw signs of habitation. Cheese rinds, chicken bones, and corn cobs were scattered on the floorboards. She could smell a chamber pot that had gone too long without emptying. Darrett came to the end of the hall, his sword drawn, and stopped in the door to the private chamber. He said nothing at first, but his eyes followed the movement of a figure, the shadow cast on the floor at his feet like a ghost. Katlyn came alongside with the others and saw Lady Chastain herself. She was in her bedclothes, her hair tangled and disheveled, her feet wrapped in rags. Her face was sallow and drawn, as if the skin were too big for her bones. She crossed the room to a high-backed chair where she sat down, her arms hanging over the sides, her hands bony, her nails overly long, and the rings too big for her fingers. "What intrusion is this? Trespassers in my home. State your names and stations." Any fear Katlyn had held for the woman was gone now. She stepped forward without hesitation and said, "I am Katlyn Barnes of Antas, friend of Prince Haille and ally to the crown. The last time I was here, you held the prince and me prisoner. How dare you address me with such a tone? I am Chancellor of Kinth." Katlyn scanned the room. The bed was unmade. Dirty dishes sat piled on a table in the corner. The air was thick with smoke from a weak fire, the remnants of book spines smoldering in the ashes.
"Your province lies in a ruin, my lady," Darrett said, with a sniff and a grimace. "What happened here? Do you require aid?"
Lady Chastain let out a cackle of laughter. "You offer me aid? Now? At this late hour? Look around you. The end has already come." Adamantus moved through the doorway, turning his antlers sideways.
"Was it Vorgs who did this?"
If she was surprised by an elk speaking, she did not betray it. Katlyn wondered if she was completely mad. Annabeth Chastain's jaw trembled, and her eyes glistened. "Vorgs? Vorgs? You mean the creatures from the wood? Nightmares they are. But no, they are allied with him, and when they passed through, they still had use for me."
"Who is this him you speak of?"
Darrett asked. Lady Chastain giggled through clenched teeth. "You still do not know who he is, do you? You are fools, fools. You have played into our hands, into his hands all this time."
"The Magus?" Adamantus asked. "Tell us his name."
"I don't know his name," she shouted, her voice breaking. As suddenly as she had laughed, she now wept, twisting at her hair and pulling it in stringy clumps. "No one knows his name, but I tell you this, he does not go where he is not invited."
"You made an ally of him," Adamantus said.
Lady Chastain let out a pain-ridden sob. "I did. I thought I could control him, command his men. I wanted to be part of their new order, but they never wanted order, only chaos. And when the walls came tumbling down, they called upon the monsters to scatter the people and unseat the council. I was just a traitor to them. Having betrayed my people once, they did not trust me themselves. But I resisted. He tried to control me," she said, and pointed across the room to a vanity. The mirrors were shattered, the candlesticks toppled, the jars of powder and perfume cracked and spilling their contents. And in the center of the tabletop sat a moonstone, set in a choker and adorned with amber, a lidless, glowing eye. "I'm no fool. I knew what the stone would do to me, but he found other ways to control me. He took my daughters from me, and when they came to punish me, they brought a brand shaped into the word traitor. They heated it in the fire. I begged them to have mercy, begged them to spare me. Anything, I said. Anything. Anyone. Not me. She went silent, her fingers working her hair, her eyes on the floor. Katlyn felt Talia take a step closer to her own side, so that their shoulders touched. It was reassuring. They listened, Lady Chastain said. They listened to me. Anyone but me, I had said. So they followed through. My daughter, my only daughter he did not slay, Annabelle. They burned her with the brand, her face, her hands. I can still hear her screams. Katlyn felt the blood drain from her face. The fate was worse than she would have wished on anyone, even Annabelle, who had so often teased and bullied her at the academy, who had also set them free that night they had been trapped at the manor. Queasy, Katlyn walked to the window, pushing it open for fresh air. A bracing breeze swept in around her as she leaned with both hands on the sill. The men that had escorted them were running about below, shouting to one another. Some were drawing their swords.
"Riders at the gate!"
one called up to her. Darrett and Gale rushed out of the room. Katlyn was ready to follow when she heard a familiar chirping. A fluttering flash of blue danced around her head and before her eyes. It was not azure, nor was it sapphire. Scion! The boy jay danced in the air, flapping his wings until she reached out a trembling hand for him to perch upon. He sang out a joyous tremolo. You silly bird! We thought you were lost. At her words, he lifted into the air and swooped down to the gate, where a pack of riders were galloping through. At their lead was a familiar face. Are they friend or foe? Talia asked, her spear ready. Friend, she said, and cried out the window to her original champion. Cody Youngblood! Cody turned in his saddle, caught sight of her, and his face brightened with the smile so many women found irresistible. Even Talia let out a wordless hum of pleasure.
"Lady Katlyn, I am at your service," he called up with a flourish and a bow.
Chapter 19. Soledor. The ship slipped into Soledor harbor, the water reflecting the morning sky stippled with clouds that caught the golden color of the rising sun. The shore was enclosed by steep bluffs, which crowded ramshackle sheds, shops, and homes that made up the unrecognized settlement that had become the base of the resistance. Or so Val had said. Now, as the men in the towboat strained against the oars to draw the rest bar to dock, Haille watched from behind the bow, Chloe beside him. He listened as a set of footsteps approached them. Haille turned to see Val holding a sheathed sword. Haille knew the sword well, the top of the handle fashioned into the profile of an elk, the antlers branching through the crossguard and holding a heart between them. Haille stared at Elkhart, the sword crafted for him by Pathis Sumberland himself. It was like a relic from another life, and Haille, at first, hesitated to take it back.
"It's yours, Prince Haille. You wielded it well, and it's about time you did so again."
Haille could feel Chloe's eyes watching him. He sensed that the trainings, the beatings, the discussions had all led to this. It was more than taking back a sword, but rather an identity.
"I don't know if I'm worthy, ready even," Haille said, his hand stopping short of the handle.
Truth is, we never are, Chloe said in a warm, soft voice beside him. Take it, Haille. It's yours. Haille clasped the handle, pleased at how familiar it felt, how light and balanced the blade was compared to the clumsy practice swords that he had been using. His mentors had little else to say. The moment of testing passed. This was the beginning of further tests, where failing meant death for himself and others. As he buckled the sword and sheath to his belt, he felt a weight more than physical on his shoulders. But, like Val had said long ago in the house of Sandal and Blythewood, where they had stayed with the elves of Sidon, Haille knew it was time to at least put forward a face of courage. It's only when you are afraid that you truly know if you can be brave. Val's words from that night echoed in his mind. Haille turned to the captain, weighing so many of his lessons in his mind. Val, for his part, stood at the foremost point of the bow, his lips set in a fine, pensive line. Haille did not need to ask what troubled him. With a look to the shore, he could see it for himself. The docks were empty of movement. The ships moored there were few, and the sky above the town was clear. Not a fire was burning in a single hearth. No smoke, not even gulls hovered in the air over the town. Then Haille saw a single skiff, bobbing in the water, sending out tiny spreading circles of waves. All eyes were on the skiff as its lone passenger pulled up the oars as he neared the towing boat and glided past to come alongside the rest bar. "Well, if it isn't the devil himself," Chloe said from behind Val, who leaned over the rail, relief turning the creases in his face to smile lines.
"Cody, you are a welcome emissary. Welcome indeed,"
Val said.
"Captain Manderley,"
Cody said, saluting as the skiff neared. Val's expression turned quizzical.
"Why the formality, old friend? What news? Soledor looks like a ghost town." "The militia has decamped for higher ground, just over the bluffs, but a few longshoremen remain ready to meet you. Steer for the southernmost pier. I'll meet you there."
Val shouted toward the towboat.
"You are the man. Pull to starboard."
The men altered their course, while Val turned to Gunther.
"See if you can spell a zephyr into the sails to help them."
Gunther nodded, walking back to the stern, Gregor alongside him. With a few enchantments, they called forth a gentle breeze that aided the men straining at the oars of the towboat. Still, the rest bar was heavy, laden with many passengers, and waterlogged from sailing through the rain. Cody reached the pier long before them, and Haille watched as their old friend tied up his own boat and walked the length of the pier to the shore, where he sat alone, waiting on a barrel next to a leaning structure with boarded windows and a patched roof. It was the largest structure Haille could see in the town of small buildings, and he guessed it would make a good place to shelter the many escaped slaves they carried with them.
"I long to hear that old dog's adventures since we left him in Kerith to head north,"
Val said to Chloe. "Yes," she said, picking a blister on her palm, then biting some of the dead skin away. "Funny, though. When was the last time you knew him to call you by your surname?" Val shrugged.
"Never."
Neither seemed to think much more of the incongruity. Val moving to the gangway, Chloe following, spitting out the piece of skin she had freed from her palm. Haille was close behind, and descending the gangway onto the planks of the dock. Sailors secured the lines, while the men they had freed worked their way off the ship, carrying the wounded and the weak. The dock was soon crowded, and Val turned from supervising the movement of men and supplies to ask Haille to fetch Cody, who was still seated at the end of the dock, whittling a stick with a dagger.
"Go see what is keeping him. Ask if we can move the men to that warehouse."
Haille nodded and worked his way through the throng of men to walk the length of the pier to where Cody waited, a harbor bell hanging on the post behind him. Cody continued to whittle his stick into a sharp point. Azure accompanied Haille, floating from one pylon to the next, her chirps loud in the quiet morning. The water below the planks at Haille's feet was black and covered with an oily sheen. The bluffs rose overhead, appearing higher now that he was on shore, their tops blocking the palette of colors presented by the morning sky. It was a peaceful morning. So why wasn't Haille feeling more settled? He shivered as he walked from sun into shadow. The lanes leading to the shore were still empty. Not even a cat wandered past looking for fish scraps. He was wondering where the longshoremen were that Cody had spoken of, when he thought he saw something move beyond the gap in the door to the warehouse.
"Prince Haille, we meet again,"
Cody said. He had slid the dagger into its sheath and did not look up as he cleaned his nails with the tip of the stick.
"Cody, Val wants to know where we can lead the men. Some are wounded from battle," he said, watching Azure land near the door to the warehouse. "Can we take them into that warehouse there?"
Cody's eye twitched, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smile.
"Why don't you go see?"
Haille hesitated. Something did not feel right, with Cody, the town, the morning all together. Where were the people, the animals, the birds? Why was the place preternaturally silent? His nose twitched at a foul odor. It was sour, dark, something different than the smell of dung, fish offal, and tarred timbers that characterized most port towns. The planks of the dock were shaking as Val and the others made their way closer. Cody's eyes flashed up at them, and his jaw flexed. Haille noticed Azure hopping closer to the gap in the warehouse door, her head twitching as she peered inside. He stepped closer to the shore. As he did, something just below the surface of the water caught his eye. It was a face. At first he thought it was his own reflected, but he realized it was not, nor was it alone. At that moment, Azure let out a panicked warble, her wings snapping as she made straight for Haille. He turned to run. "It's a trap!" he cried out to the others. But Cody was already up, his hand clasped around the harbor bell's clapper. The bell sounded, and the sailors and passengers of the rest bar became still, just as the doors to the warehouse groaned open, and a nightmare issued forth. Vorgs. The noise of their cries was like a herd of boars, their mismatched armor jangling as they rushed out, the whole warehouse filled to its back walls with their gray and green bodies. The flood of horror parted and coursed around Cody, whose own face had turned into a demonic mask, his eyes burning with hate for his former friends.
"To arms!"
Val called out, but no sooner had he cried out than the Vorgs were upon them, flashing blades and wielding cudgels. Haille drew Elkhart and joined in the fight, but the ground was not advantageous. The Vorgs, greater in number, poured down the length of the pier, pushing many of the surprised men into the water, where Haille now saw the sunken bodies of hundreds of dead militia soldiers. Their break came as Gregor and Gunther rushed to the fore, and together called upon a wave that sucked up the water from the shore, exposing rocks and the tangled bodies of dead men, built into a mountain of water and swept across the pier, sending the first line of Vorgs spilling into the harbor. Haille hacked and stabbed his way forward, grateful now for the practice Val and Chloe had insisted upon, both of them close, on his left and right. The bell had stopped ringing, Cody gone from its side. Haille searched the chaos for him, and did not have to look far. Their friend was descending upon them, his sword drawn, his stare fixed on Haille himself. 2 men from the rest bar engaged Cody, and he made quick work slaying them. His fighting form advanced from what Haille knew of their friend. Val and Chloe readied themselves, their swords drawn, but their faces still confused.
"Cody, what is the meaning of this?"
Val cried. Cody's answer was steel. He met blades with Val and turned to catch Chloe as she flanked him. She twisted in close, drawing a knife with her free hand, but Cody raised his own empty palm, flexed his fingers, and sent Chloe flying off the dock and over the water to the shore, where she crashed into a stack of crates, which shattered into splinters from the impact. Haille's skull tingled, as he had learned it would in the presence of powerful magic. Cody closed in on the flabbergasted Val, but stopped when a horn sounded from the bluffs above. The bluffs presented a steep wall of earth along the length of the town, but the north and south slopes were gentle enough to ride down on horseback, and riders were coming, letting out a war cry, flying the banner of Antas at the fore. Leading the charge was an elk with a shining crown of silver.
"It's Adamantus," Haille said.
The Vorgs abandoned their attack on the ship and began to regroup in the space before the warehouse, shoring up their flanks by closing together shields and throwing up barricades of barrels and crates. It was of little use. The riders came down like an avalanche, crashing into the hastily built shield wall and trampled Vorgs before them. Howls, screeches, whinnies, and yells rose up to the heavens as horses, men, and monsters collided. Adamantus showed no mercy as he slashed and impaled one Vorg after another with his antlers. To Haille's greater confusion, he saw another Cody, this one on horseback with a Corinthian ranger to his left, and a rider who Haille thought to be Avenger Red on Cody's right. "Haille!" a familiar voice called out. He turned to see Katlyn riding up to him, a compact girl in Morvant war paint and bare arms riding beside her, letting fly one arrow after another into the Vorgs with deadly efficiency.
"Katlyn, is it really you?"
"Of course it is."
"Then who is that?"
he said, pointing to the first Cody, who on foot was still slaying men, his sword red and bloody. A rider tried to trample him, but Cody struck in close, stabbed the man in his thigh, unhorsed him, and mounted himself in the saddle. As he did so, the second Cody spied him, surprise on his face. The first Cody organized the Vorgs, and they formed into ranks for a counterattack, riders having broken through their ranks, but the Vorgs had superior numbers.
"We are still outnumbered," Haille said.
"Not for long," Katlyn said as another horn blasted a high, pure note that sounded like sunlight breaking through clouds. It felt like power and hope, like the inexorable coming of spring after a long winter. Haille's heart skipped a beat. "There!" Katlyn pointed to the southern shore. Pounding through surf and sand on a wave of ponies, their manes flying, were riders in resplendent armor that caught the slanting morning sun. Their faces and blades seemed to glow with their own light, and the water formed a sparkling aura around them. "The elves have come!" No sooner had Katlyn spoken did Haille pick out the figures leading the charge. Caliph, Lazalorn, and between them, her hair flying like a war banner, her sword lowered for immediate attack, rode Violin. A howl of terror rose from the Vorg horde, and they began to scatter, but it was too late. The elves were upon them with fire, bolts, and blades. Many of the men from the ship, never having seen such a spectacle, cowered, but the men led by the second Cody pressed on from the north, and soon the Vorgs were overrun. A chorus of chirping followed as the Jays, all three of them, Sapphire, Cyan, and Azure, reunited about Haille's shoulders. Baby Jays, just in the nick of time. Adamantus barreled through a group of Vorgs, then came alongside Haille and stopped to regard the unfolding battle. The elk locked eyes with the first Cody. This Cody snarled, reared his horse, and began to gallop in the opposite direction.
"It's the Magus,"
Adamantus exclaimed. "Come on," Katlyn said, pulling Haille up beside her on the saddle with the confidence of an experienced rider. So much had changed since they had first fled Antas City, when she had struggled to remain in a saddle. All was movement, wild swords swinging and clanging collisions of blades, armor, and claws as they pressed through the mob. Katlyn spurred her horse on at a reckless speed. The Morvant girl fended off attacks for them until they were free of the battle completely and followed the chase. Adamantus pursued, down empty lanes, past storefronts and porches, trading houses and taverns. The imposter Cody pushed his horse forward even as it stumbled, its strength flagging. Adamantus closed the distance, and Cody turned down a lane between two buildings. The elk disappeared around the corner, not breaking off his pursuit. Katlyn kicked her own horse to follow faster, the Morvant girl covering their backs. The lane opened up to a square that backed up to the bluffs themselves. It must have been a place for trading slaves, for a block with chains was set in the center. The imposter Cody rode up to the block and circled it. Nowhere left to go. Katlyn pulled up on the reins, her horse coming to a stop, the Morvant girl next to them. "Talia, stay close," Katlyn said. The girl called Talia knocked back an arrow and took aim at the imposter Cody while Adamantus approached. "Stygorn," Cody said. "What is old is new and new is old. Our meeting was inevitable, was it not?" Adamantus raked the ground with a hoof. "Reveal yourself. The time for masks and illusions is over." "Is it?" Cody said, swinging his sword. "Illusion has served me well. We know our roles. We were enemies long before the whelps behind you were ever born, long before these kingdoms were founded. We remember the empires whose ashes they rose from." "Some empires should remain in the past. And some creatures outlive their time, as do some servants, their masters." Adamantus had heard enough and charged. Cody, or the magus disguised as him, rode out to meet him. Adamantus would show no mercy, swinging his antlers low and slashing open the neck of the horse. The animal fell to its knees and onto its belly with a bellow, its life blood pouring out in a red gush. The magus pitched forward onto the ground and tumbled over before coming to his feet and drawing a short sword from his belt. Dirt mixed with blood on his forehead, and his teeth showed, white as his mad, wild eyes. They clashed again, antlers against steel, but unlike the Vorgs or other adversaries Haille had seen challenge Adamantus, the magus knew how to meet the elk's attacks, catching his blows and counterattacking, so that the elk had to step sideways and backwards, his hooves scraping and stabbing the ground for balance, fans of dirt spinning up into the air about them both. The magus, still in Cody's likeness, spun forward in an attack that slipped past Adamantus' defenses and scoured a gash on his head between his eyes. Cody's comely face smiled, the blood dripping from his sword. Adamantus circled once before driving in again with an attack that left the magus on his back. Adamantus brought his hooves down, but the magus kicked up his legs, landed upright, and sidestepped just as the elk landed. Talia's bowstring twanged and sent an arrow spinning at the magus' back. But, with a glance and a narrowing of his eyes, he cast the arrow into flames, so that only soot and embers remained in a cloud. Adamantus swung down his rack of antlers in a straight-on attack, this time driving the magus backwards, his feet sliding in the dirt. As he began to lose his footing, he bent his knees, rolled to the ground, somersaulted, and landed running. He placed the trading block between them. As they circled, Haille noticed a new gash on Adamantus' shoulder. "You've overplayed your hand, Elk," the magus said, his face misshapen, the illusion protecting his identity slipping. "We'll see," Adamantus said, but Haille noticed one of the elk's legs buckle as he paced around the block. The magus' form shimmered again, and out of his torso grew 2 more arms, each with swords identical to his first 2. He spun them like interlocking windmills. Haille knew it to be an illusion, but it was a confusing one. Which blades were real? Which blades would Adamantus block? The magus charged, leaping from the block. Adamantus reversed his steps and held his ground, swinging, dipping, stabbing at the blades, the antlers sounding each time they struck true. Haille could not tell real from fake, nor could Talia or Katlyn, for they gasped many times together when they thought one of the real blades had slipped past Adamantus' crown, only to pass through his head or body, as ephemeral as a shadow. "I can't watch," Katlyn said. "It will be over soon," Haille said, sure that the elk now held the upper hand, as he continued to guess correctly which limbs and blades were real and which were fake. The elk could control the pace of the fighting now, driving the magus backwards. Haille only grew afraid when the magus lost ground and moved towards the three of them as they watched. Haille thought to move farther back, out of range, but he was too late. The magus, sensing an opening, turned and flung his swords end over end towards them. "Watch out," Haille said, diving from the saddle and pulling Katlyn and Talia down with him. "No," Adamantus said, stepping in the path of the flying blades. But they faded and evaporated along with the phantom limbs, only a feint. Adamantus staggered suddenly, having guessed wrong this one time. The elk shook and coughed up blood as the magus' real sword buried hilt deep in his chest. With a final flourish, the magus dragged the short sword across Adamantus' neck. His eyes rolling back to the sky, Adamantus fell. The misshapen face that only faintly resembled Cody now shimmered in a devious smile of triumph. He kicked his sword free as Adamantus rolled to his side, his antlers sending up sprays of dirt, his hooves gouging at the earth. "Adamantus!" Haille heard himself cry. He drew Elkhart and scrambled to his feet. The magus, whoever he was, smiled, welcoming Haille's foolhardy attack. But his expression changed when the elven horn sounded once more, and Violin, her brothers, Val and Chloe rounded the corner of the square. The magus threw his blades aside, abandoning them. His body shrank and twisted into a raven, and rose into the air, flying high over the houses, the bluffs, and disappearing into the sky. Haille knelt beside Adamantus, the elk on his side, his head twisted, his mouth open. Katlyn and Talia were trying to stop the bleeding, but it was of little use. Haille tore off his cloak and pressed it to the wounds, but blood, hot as bath water, covered his hands. "No, no, no." In his distress, Haille did not even realize the elk was calling his name. It was Talia who tugged his sleeve for his attention. "No, I need to hold this, to the wound," Haille said. "It is too late for that, Haille," he heard the elk whisper. He moved to the elk's face, dimly aware of the others gathered around him. He was focused on the elk's eyes, which held Haille in a powerful grasp. Haille grew still, his panicked breathing steadying, his pulse slowing. It was as if time were slowing down. It reminded him of the first night he had seen the elk in the cage, when those eyes, like twin moons, held such beauty, possibilities, and potential. Just like that night, the elk's gaze penetrated into him so that he felt it was only he and the elk, together, waiting in the moment of judgment and surrender. "Haille, you have to carry it." "Carry what?" "What I will give you. Your suffering. It has made you worthy." "I don't understand." The elk's eyes closed for a moment, then reopened, wide. Haille's body became rigid, his mind filled with light and visions he could not understand, emotions, knowledge of lifetimes that were not his own, vistas of cities in the clouds that he knew his own eyes had never seen. There were cycles of gains and losses, victory and defeats, light and dark. He fell into a cavern of eternity, where love, fear, pain, joy, ecstasy, and suffering were all the same. It was too much and would overwhelm him. He'd never be worthy. He'd be a vessel that would crack. He tried to free himself of the transference, but the spell would decide when he was free, when he would belong to himself again. His consciousness stretched to infinity. His self disappeared. Then he snapped back, a universe compressed into a grain of sand. He fell backwards in agony. For a moment, he saw Violin's face as he had seen her in the forest next to the Gilithwain before he had fallen asleep. And that was all he could now. Close his eyes to sleep, to dream, to live 1,000 lives, and die 1,000 deaths. Chapter 20. Ginger Tea and Candlelight. Haille woke to the smell of ginger tea. He opened his eyes and turned his head to meet the steady gaze of Talia studying him over her cup. She set down her drink, walked to the door, and called out for Chloe and Katlyn in a soft voice. The room Haille found himself in was small, furnished with a single bed, a table, a wash basin, and a chamber pot. Rusty hooks pointed out from the back of the door in the wall, presumably to hold cloaks or bathing cloths. It had all the generic appearance of a room at an inn that Haille imagined he had been carried into after whatever had happened. Talia returned with Chloe and Katlyn. "Welcome back again, traveler," Chloe said, brushing the hair back on his head. He was reminded of waking up on the Tamaram in the Hand Sea, his head in her lap after he had seized during the attack from Victor Twenge and his men. But on reflection, he did not feel the after-effects of such an episode. He was tired and light-headed, the room spinning with every move of his head, but that was likely from hunger. His limbs were free of the lead-like heaviness that usually weighed them down after a seizure. "What happened?" he asked. "Adamantis, is he—" "Passed," Chloe said, her tone gentle. "We're not sure what happened to you. It was like a seizure, but without the tremors." "I don't feel like I seized. I've been dreaming, but it doesn't feel like dreams either. It's like memories, but not my own." "Perhaps the elves might know," Katlyn said. Haille sat up in bed. "Where did they come from? Where did you come from?" "Cody and I met in Kinth. They were not far behind." "How did they know?" "Cyan, my reckoning. He disappeared after you were imprisoned. We thought he was lost. Turns out he had flown to seek reinforcements. The elves are able to understand his songs even better than we." Katlyn took a bowl of porridge from Talia, thanking her, and held it out for Haille. He took it with thanks, the honey-sweetened mix filling the hole in his stomach. "The Vogues?" Haille asked between spoonfuls. "Dead or fled south to Carasan's. We imagine that is where the Magus is, too." Haille swallowed hard as he remembered that figure, his changing shape, the power he commanded. "Our people, how many hurt?" "Dozens injured, many killed, but we still prevailed," Chloe said. "We've set up this building and the next as a hospital. The elves are doing their best to heal whom they can." Haille scooped the last of his porridge. Without him having to ask, Talia handed him his own cup of ginger tea. He sipped it, savoring the warmth. "I need to see him. Alone." The women looked to one another before turning to him. "We thought you might," Chloe said. "We'll take you to him, once you've finished your tea." He drained the cup and the others left him, while he slipped out from the covers and dressed. His clothes from Drellstrom were gone. Likely they had been soaked with blood anyway. A different tunic and trousers were set out for him, as well as a warm jerkin and mantle. They were relatively clean, if a bit worn, all either too big or too small, having been scavenged from the inn or the abandoned town, or perhaps from the dead themselves. But it was better than wearing the clothes stained with Adamantis lifeblood. He stepped outside into the hallway and passed by other rooms where men were convalescing, and from the sound of it, some were dying. He followed just behind Chloe, who descended a set of stairs into a great room that was warm with the heat of a fire burning in the hearth. The rafters were blackened, the floorboards worn, and smelled of yeasty ale. It was a drinking hall, but now converted into a field hospital. Elves, in their glittering armor and colorful raiment, tended to men and elves alike, the wounded stretched out on mattresses, piled rugs, or animal skins. He recognized Caliph and Lazalorn. Both were tending to a she-elf who had been wounded, the claw marks of a Vorg deep in her shoulder. The brothers nodded to him without word before turning back to their charge. Outside, on the gallery, the air was brisk. The street was busy with elves and men tending their horses, gathering around, cooking fires and sharpening their blades. It was strange to see the two races mixing so seamlessly, but Haille knew battle made fast friends.
"Prince Haille,"
Val said, stepping up from where he had been seated next to Cody and Gunther. He embraced Haille, followed by Gunther and Cody, this the real Cody. They had been seated around a brazier, along with two others who were familiar to Haille.
"Prince Haille, this is Darryd Cosland, a ranger from Kerith who has served alongside us."
The Corinthian stood and bowed. He was the same ranger who had first brought news of trouble in the south to Antas Castle the autumn before. Val paused before turning to the second figure.
"And I think you know, Gale Redmond."
Gale, who Haille had known as Avenger Red, took a knee before him. "My lord."
"I know you in a different guise,"
Haille said. "And I you." An uncomfortable silence followed that Katlyn broke. "She is changed," she said, wrapping Haille's elbow in her hand, "and has been a loyal ally and fierce friend." To his surprise, his former adversary drew her sword and offered it to him. "My life and my service are yours. I served your father in the Kerith campaign, but considering my past wrongs, I am at the mercy of your judgment." Haille's throat felt full, his voice coming out thick.
"You have my forgiveness, if you have won my friend's trust."
He turned to Katlyn, suddenly eager to leave.
"Can I see him now?"
"Of course." Katlyn led him alone through the galleries of the tavern and storefronts, avoiding the muddy streets and the drizzle that had begun to fall. They rounded on a street that was empty, but for a few men and elves who entered and exited a meeting hall, converted into a holding place for the dead. It had the same pieced-together appearance of most of Soledor, the timbers mismatched, their ends at uneven angles. The walls were tilted and either faded from sun or moldy from rain. Inside the hall, bodies of elves and men waited, some clothed in bloody, rent armor. Others were naked while being washed by friends, and still others lay cleaned beneath sheets pulled up over their heads. Haille and Katlyn walked between rows with bowed heads and lowered eyes. The hall was cold. What need was there for warmth? The air was tinged with the smell of blood, sweat, and earth. Water dripped in a basin as survivors squeezed out the cloth used to wipe the blood from a dead comrade. In the corner, 3 fair-haired elves sang a beautiful but melancholy dirge over the bodies of elves and men alike. Haille could not understand the words, but he didn't need to in order to feel their lament. He followed Katlyn into an adjoining hallway that was dark but for the candlelight flickering from a doorway on their right. Katlyn turned, the soft light bathing her face in a golden glow. "I will leave you two alone," she said, as Haille took slow steps into the doorway. Within the room, the great bulk of Adamantus' body lay peacefully, his legs folded, his head resting as if he were asleep. His wounds had been cleaned and covered, hiding their lethal violation. Candles burned from alcoves, candelabrums, and sconces. Next to the body, her hands folded across her breast, was Violin, her face veiled by her hair. Haille looked to Katlyn, who had already slipped away. He listened to the sound of her steps receding and remained in the doorway, taking in the immensity of what loss lay before him. Violin did not stir, although he knew she was aware of him. After a pause, he walked into the room, closing on Adamantus' head, resting across his forelegs. Haille touched his fingers to the antlers that were on level with his head, and found himself hoping, wishing for some magic to manifest that would wake and heal the elk, so that he would rise and march out of this house of the dead triumphant. But Adamantus remained still. Haille's hand trailed down the length of antler to rest on the elk's forehead. What is life but a series of losses? The taking away never stops. He was not sure if he was making any sense, but Violin turned her face and looked at him with the same deep gaze she had when they had last looked upon each other across the waters of the Vorax. Her intact cheekbone cast a light shadow on her face. It was a refined and graceful contrast to the scar that ran across the right side of her face. The wound had healed, but left a jagged line in her flesh, a memory of her own suffering. Haille shook his head. Adamantus told me something just before he died. He said that my suffering had made me worthy. I don't know what he meant. Someone once told me that we grow more from subtraction than addition, more from suffering than pleasure, Violin said. Haille swallowed, noting how the elk's fur still shone in the candlelight. That is a grim outlook when spoken aloud, but in the past weeks, months, subtraction and loss seem to be the only lessons life has to teach me. She pushed a strand of hair from her face. He was reminded of the night at Fire Point, how she had struggled to pull the strands from the still weeping wound. You seem changed, Haille. Not like when we met. He exhaled. Triumphs and losses, but mostly losses played across the stage of his memory for a moment. I had more hope then. And now? Sometimes I only feel despair, he said, watching the shadows on the wall. Val and Chloe have tried to help. They tell me to live for life, love, a cause, connection. But what's the point? It's all taken away from us in the end. Isn't it better to have died side by side with a friend than lived a whole life without one? She stopped, and in an apologetic tone she changed course. At least, that is what they say. Haille pressed his palm to Adamantus' neck. He thought of the groans and sighs of dying men he had heard in the inn earlier. So much needless suffering. I once heard a teacher say that detachment was the key to not suffering, but that does not help the man I heard dying on the way here. Violin stepped to her left. Why are you so afraid of suffering? Haille turned to look at her as she circled the elk. Who wants a world of detachment? She continued. Suffering is not needless, Haille. Above life and love, suffering can be the end to the means. I believe it is a thing that can ennoble us. Haille sniffed, regarding Adamantus' shape once more. Then we should leave all the prisoners, council members, my mentor Yana, to their imprisonment by the Magus and his horde, because their suffering ennobles them. That is not what I meant. To remove suffering when one can is honorable, a calling to us all. But when it is inevitable, how we choose to respond can give us meaning, power. That is my solace in times like these. Is it wishful thinking? Haille asked, looking through the antlers to the braces of the ceiling. Haille, where would your power be without your wounds? She had made a circuit of the elk and now stood on his left, her hair glistening darkly in the candle glow. Haille's eyes came to rest on her scar. My wounds diminish me. Adamantus' wounds killed him. The same for my father. We can be noble despite loss. Who doesn't love a lost cause? We thinking beings can add meaning to suffering, resolving to stay noble despite it, as Adamantus did until his last breath. It's a gift. Gifts, burdens. Adamantus spoke of both. Our choice makes all the difference, I believe." She knelt down on the floor alongside where he had settled, looking into the elk's face. "A grave responsibility, but it is what we make it." To his surprise, she reached across and squeezed his hand. He stared at his hand in hers. "I have dreams now, Violin. Visions, like memories. I don't know what to make of them, but they are there, in the back of my mind even now, like thunder on the horizon. I don't know what to make of them. A dam breaking, a city in the clouds, a sword falling with the rain out of the heavens, into the sea. Mysterious are the Stygorn, but it was a spell of transference that passed between him and you before he died." "Transference of what?" "I don't know. It is a question I would pose to my elders, Gandalin and Seraphina." "I feel like I'm supposed to do something with it." She released his hand, straightening her legs to stand, and walked to the doorway. Before leaving him alone, she said, "Then you probably are." "The moonstones are powerful, dangerous relics," Violin said. She stood in the center of the room, her voice raised to carry over the crowd of fighters, elves and human alike. "They have been tools for the Magus to hide his identity while manipulating his victims. But we can turn the gaze back on him. He is linked to them, and with the right magic and combination of powers, we might be able to see into his mind." "And learn his plans?" Val asked, sitting close to her in the front row of fighters. "And his weaknesses," Caliph added. "If he has any," Lazlorn said. "Every man has weaknesses," Chloe replied. "We still don't know if he is a man, a woman, elf, or human, but we may learn. There are many of us now, and only one Magus," Violin said. "A lot of havoc has been caused by just one," Haille reflected. He scanned the room, full of fighters joined to their cause, strangers and friends, old and new, Gale being one of the most surprising, but, according to others, deeply loyal to his father's memory. Caliph and Lazlorn spoke for the elves of Sidon that had come to their aid. Val sat with Cody, and Chloe near to him, Gunther next to his wife, and Gregor, who preferred to be called his true name of Nathan now, next to them. Caitlin and Talia rounded out the circle, sitting just to Hale's left. "We will need volunteers, those with the gift of magic," Violin continued. Gunther and Nathan stood, Caliph and Lazlorn as well. Haille made to rise, but was secretly relieved when Violin put her hand on his shoulder. "5 will be enough, as long as there is one more than the moonstones. You must wait until you are stronger." "Who will be your 5th? "Me," Violin said. The 3 elves and 2 humans joined hands around the broken plinth in the center of the room, where the 4 moonstones that had been collected waited. One from Oion, one from Kyruna, one from Annabeth Chastain, and one from the Revenant on Dralstrom. Pried from their necklaces, chokers, and collars, they were beautiful and identical in color, but unique in the ever-moving patterns of swirls on their surfaces. Haille felt a cold chill each time he looked at them, and a dreadful pull, the way he had once been drawn to throw himself from the edges of the highest towers in the castle when he had been at his lowest. Each stone possessed the same eerie sense of depth, as if looking over a cliff's edge or imagining an ocean trench. Violin called for silence. The elves in the room closed their eyes. The humans, newer to magic, did the opposite, and no one more than Chloe, who watched her husband settle into the circle, locking hands with the elves who were more practiced and knowledgeable than he. Haille imagined his own face reflected the same anxiety as he looked to Nathan. Caitlin reached out to grab his hand, and Talia's with the other. Collectively, they held their breath. It was Lazalorn, most taciturn of all of them, who began the chant, his voice low and deep. It was in a language Haille did not understand, but the words were full of power. As Nathan had taught him, Haille concentrated to put a simple shield between himself and the others, as the currents of magic were already making his skin feel cold and his scalp tingle. No longer distracted by the interference, Haille noticed the details of the room. The light from the windows dimmed, as if a cloud had passed over the face of the sun. The shadows in the room grew. A tremor shook the boards under his feet and continued up his legs into his spine and to the ends of his arms. Katlyn felt it too, turning her face to him, questioning. He had no answers. "They are glowing," Talia marveled. A faint blue aura radiated from the center of the room. The elves' faces were calm and serene, their eyes closed to it, but Gunther and Nathan looked startled. Cody reached for his sword. Val placed a hand on his shoulder to steady him. Chloe's expression, stony with concern, was unchanged. Haille noticed that Violin's and her brother's eyes moved beneath their lids, as if they were dreaming in their sleep. He could detect subtle shifts of emotion, effort, revelation, puzzlement, and even fear in their faces. The strain became more pronounced in their expressions, their hands beginning to tremble, the muscles of their forearms flexing. The pressure on his own hand increased. Katlyn bit down on her lip. The plinth with the stones shook from a jolt, dust falling from its sides, the stones wobbling. The windows rattled in their panes, and a voice, ghostly, disembodied, echoed around them, its syllables sharp, even if the meaning of the words was lost on Haille. Lazalorn raised his voice in response, his siblings joining him. The voice growled in response, shaking the hall as if a great dragon were stirring under their feet. "You dare," Haille heard it say. Now all the elves joined the droning chant, their voices in unison. The ceiling shook, buffeted by a gust from the sea that gave no sign of abating. Haille heard the startled cries of men and elves outside, surprised by the abrupt change in weather. The light from outside grew weak, while the aura of the stones had coalesced into a shape, something like a hooded figure with glowing blue eyes. Not human, not demon, but a specter of some sort. The stone of the plinth grew white as the moonstones heated it. "You dare to disturb the balance," Violin spoke back. "You disrupt a long peace of a gracious order." Nathan was shivering, tears running from his clenched eyes. "I am order. I am balance. I am power," the voice responded in booming tones, followed by a groan and flash from the stones themselves. The 5 figures in the circle fell backwards. Chloe was quick enough to catch her husband, easing him to the ground, while the others were left to fall upon the floor. The wind outside died. The light grew normal once again. The fire in the hearth crackled anew. The plinth began to cool as the other witnesses attended to those from the circle. "I'm all right," Gunther told Chloe. "Check on Nathan." Katlyn and Talia obeyed, Nathan's head between them. He was panting, as if having just run a race. "I'm better now that he's gone. The pain, it was horrible." "What did you see?" Violin asked, rubbing her own head as if nursing a headache. "A dungeon with dripping walls, people in chains, and Vorgs, rank upon rank, waiting behind city walls, filling city streets. He has brought discipline to them," Caliph said. "It was Kersan's. I recognized it. I saw it from above, as if I were standing on the fire tower," Gunther said. "The lighthouse?" Val asked. Gunther nodded.
And the Rachne, the Dark Elks. I saw them too, Lazalorn said.
As did I. Violin stood up. He is preparing for us in Karazhan's.
The city is well fortified. We're doomed,
an anonymous man said from the crowd.
We would be fools to attack right when and where he wants us to.
We can't wait, Violin said. They have hostages. This will be his last stand or ours?
Did anyone see him or sense his identity?
Val asked. Those from the circle shook their heads. It felt familiar to me, but I still know nothing of who he is, Nathan said.
Wasn't that him we saw there?
Cody pointed to the empty space where the apparition had materialized.
No,
Violin said firmly. Only a part of him. He has communed with the stones so often that they retain a part of his consciousness. What we saw was an aspect of him, but there is no telling whether or not he knows we have looked into the stones.
I sensed only great power. A complex, disciplined, and learned mind,
Caliph said.
I would advise we wait, too, for the armies of Anthor to join us from Kereth, or even reinforcements of our own from Sidon. But I also sensed his intent to kill the prisoners, the citizens of Karazhan's, the members of the council.
Yana, Haille said. Yana, yes. Who is she? Caliph said the name over.
The closest person I have to a parent left,
Haille said, Katlyn placing her arm around him.
Interesting, Caliph said. I think the Magus knows this. He wants to use it against you.
Haille sat back down, his bones aching, his stomach aflame.
It was clear he has devoted much time to thinking of you, Nathan, and you, Prince Haille,
Lazalorn said, eyebrows raised.
I sensed it as well,
Gunther said, turning to Nathan.
Is there anything you can tell us of him? You are the only one to have met him in the flesh.
Nathan sat up and wiped his brow. It was so long ago. I would know his face, I think, but who knows if it was really his own he revealed. We have seen that he is skilled with illusions and glamours, but I sensed his ire toward me. I have betrayed him, but perhaps that emotion let me see deeper into him than any of you, for I glimpsed something I had not before.
What is it?
Violin leaned closer to him. Nathan's throat fluttered.
A plan. As if he has seen all this before. A plan falling into place that only ends one way, in fire, blood, and death.
The room went quiet. Haille could sense the question on all their minds, on the tips of all their tongues. Why not wait? Wait for reinforcements, wait for a better time. But Val, as if sensing the turning point, the fulcrum of where things turned, stood up.
We wait, the prisoners die. We've seen the Vorgs, the elves have told us their taste for human flesh. We've dealt them one defeat today. Let us not let up while our boot is already on their neck. Let us not give them more time to prepare, to build barricades, to fletch their arrows, string their bows, sharpen their blades, and grow strong on the flesh of our brothers and sisters. I don't want to fight for a city full of broken and gnawed bones, empty, desolate homes. I am for life. If we go before the city gates to challenge them, and we perish, knowing we did not run, knowing we rose to fight when the fight was on us, knowing we serve the right, the light, and in that service, we will live full lives and die good deaths. Who is with me?
By the resounding cry that rose up, shaking the hall once more, Haille concluded, everybody.